Ted Lemon, who is the owner and winemaker of Littorai. These two gentlemen are truly the pioneers of the Sonoma Coast appellation and the West Sonoma Coast. They are a large reason why all of us other winemakers are now making wine on the coast, and we're very thrilled and happy to have them here, and they have an incredible story to share with you guys. So let's give them a hand.
Thank you, Carol, and welcome everybody. This should be fun. We want to keep it open. I want to make sure that if you have questions, you throw them out and you don't hesitate, and I'll try to, see you and make sure that you can speak up, but don't hesitate to jump in. I'm really excited about this. I've been looking forward to this for quite a long time. As you can imagine, for me, like many other people who grow Pinot Noir and Chardonnay and other varieties in western Sonoma County, the man to my left is, of course, a legend, and not many of us get to that status. So I'm delighted to be sitting with one today, and we'll harass him about it a little bit too. But I thought it would be fun to approach this in a very relaxed way. There's some questions I have for Burt that, of course, are kind of the basics that I think we'd all like to know. But I want to make sure that you jump in if you have questions and you don't hesitate to be part of the discussion. I think it's really important. There are in the audience several people. If I could just point them out, if you just raise your hand, because if I miss somebody, I apologize. But just in case you have a question, other people who've been around, families that have been around for a while, West Sonoma Coast. Regina Martinelli's right there. So Regina may be able to bring in some Martinelli history. David Hirsch. David, where did you go? There's David right there. Anybody else that I'm thinking about? That of the current generation, there's Teresa Heredia, who we'll meet in a little bit. Anyway, there's several of us here. I'm sure I'll see someone else in a moment. But it's a fun forum. I'm delighted to see John Hager is here. If you don't know his book, it's a wonderful book about American Pinot Noir, and I strongly recommend that you pick it up if you get the opportunity. It's a very thorough, careful work on Pinot Noir and how it came to be in the United States. So I'm sure John will be able to jump in also. Burt, good morning.
Good morning.
Thanks for coming.
Okay.
We're excited to have you. And I want to jump in with the most basic question of all, which is, how did you first get interested in wine? What took you there?
Oh, just I've always drank wine ever since I was a kid, 17, 16 years old. My uncle was French, and we always had wine at the dinner table at his house. And I never really liked beer like most of my friends, so it's just wine for me. And as I got older, I got more interested into Burgundies and wines that after a while became too expensive for me to buy. And that's how the winery came about. We decided to start making wine that we could no longer afford.
Do you remember, which you soon could no longer afford?
Yes.
Do you have any memories of wines from that period of being a 17-year-old or whatever that stick out? I mean, I can think of a wine when I was, that age. It's like, oh, I remember drinking that wine. Is there anything you can remember of?
Not really from that age. In my 20s, I can remember certain wines I had. Certain things, from like a Cuvée Brunet from House by Selyem, that always stuck out. And, some Romany Sans Vivant.
Born a little too late.
Yeah, those wines at one time were available, and they weren't, so high that you couldn't buy them.
But that's pretty extraordinary to be a young person or a young man drinking that kind of Burgundy. There weren't a lot of people in the States that even knew what it was.
Probably not. I had my doubts when we got into the wine business that many wouldn't recognize what we were doing.
Yeah.
For the same reason.
Was that partly because of this uncle who was he a wine lover or what?
Well, when we had dinner, we always had 4 wines at the table. So, you know, we'd start with champagne, and then there'd be a white wine, and red wine, and then usually some form of dessert drink.
Nice.
Maybe that's why I couldn't remember the red wine.
I should have tried to get invited over to Burt's a long time ago. And did something in that period when you were not yet a professional winemaker, was there something that drew you to Pinot Noir, or?
Well, just my love of Burgundy, and I always loved Zinfandel too, and being from Sonoma County. That's sort of our base wine here, and drank a lot of that when I was young. Again, very cheap, very nice wines though, and you know, so that's how I got interested in making wine. And the first wines I made were from Zinfandel.
Yeah. As a home winemaker.
As a home winemaker.
And how many years of home winemaking zin did you do before you tried Pinot?
Oh, I'm probably 3 or 4 of Zinfandel, and then in '79 we tried some Pinot Noir, and again in '80.
Okay. And was that home winemaking part of the family tradition, or was that you
No,
saying,
that was,
I'm really interested in
yeah, no, it wasn't part of our tradition. No, we're mostly Irish. Maybe whiskey making.
Well, if you're Irish, you should have remembered the bottle at the end of the meal, right? So what in that Zinfandel period, which obviously this is something you took on yourself, was there a seed of getting into it professionally? Did you think, gee, it would be fun to work for a winery, or tell us about?
No, in '79 and '80 we bought a lot more grapes than we could drink the wine from.
Yeah.
So we started selling it under the table illegally. And we got a call from David Lose, I think he was the EATF agent. Late '80, that maybe we should bond before he came looking for us.
How did he even know you were out there?
Some of our wine was in wineries. Other winemakers were buying the wine.
Oh. Boy, so, yeah.
He saw it in Iron Horse's tasting room, or near wherever Forrest Hanser made his wines at the time.
And was he very casual about it, or was he like a G-man?
He was casual about it. He just said we should get bonded before we get arrested.
I would have died if some fan said that to me.
We got bonded. That was almost as bad.
Yeah, right, almost as painful. So that would put the beginning of the home Zinfandel production to mid-70s, is that right?
No, well, yeah. First wine I made was in 1964. So, but then I skipped gears and then started again, and so it was. It didn't get serious to '79. That's when we started buying 3 tons of fruit instead of 1 ton.
But that sort of debunks the quasi myth that you guys just suddenly came out of nowhere. I mean, this was a lifelong passion for you. Obviously.
Yeah. And my partner was the wine buyer for Spears Market, so he was drinking wine all the time, tasting wine, and we were going to wine tastings together all the time, regular wine tastings and one just for the trade, and so we were fortunate enough to be able to taste a lot of things.
How did you and Ed meet? Tell us about it. You were both from Sonoma County? You were.
Yeah, well, I was born in San Francisco, and we always had a summer house in the Russian River. And we moved up here when I was 14, and I graduated from Manly High School. So, yeah, I basically grew up on the Russian River and graduated, and then became a printer, in the International Typographical Union, and served a 6-year apprenticeship And in that would have been in 58, I graduated. In 62, we bought a house on the Russian River, my wife and I. And that's the house I still live in.
And so you and Ed met at the market?
Yeah, no, Ed was a family, well, when I grew up, one of the kids I grew up with was Ed's brother-in-law, Brad Nickel, and Brad's sister was Gail Nickel, who became Gail Selyem. And so I met him through, old-time family friends.
So I think what we should do is, like, if you don't know this, Spears Market is right down here in Forestville. I think we should put a shrine out front. And put little things in front of every now and then. It's in Stone Marker now.
Yeah.
So you guys met, became friends, I assume, and
Right.
tasted a lot of wine together.
Tasted a lot of wine together, and then we started making wine together, and that worked into what I said. We bonded and started the winery, and originally we made wine at Russian River Vineyards. They rented us space there for our tanks and charged us a minimal thing. I forget whether it was $25 or $50 a ton to run it through their books and do that. And by '83, we had found the building in Fulton and rebuilt it and moved the winery to there. So '81, '82, we made the wine on Russian River Vineyards bonded space. And by '83, we had our own bonded space in Fulton.
And we talked a little bit about the Burgundian inspiration, but I would love to get some feedback for all of us on what else existed out there, if anything, in American Pinot Noir that you had tasted, that you had enjoyed, either in that sort of early '80s
Oh, yeah.
period, or
Yeah.
or going back as far as you can think. What were there any Pinots you went from the States with? Wow, that's a nice wine.
Yeah, every once in a while there would be one.
Can you give us some?
Yeah, I think Iron Horse in 1972. Dick Arrowwood would have been the winemaker then, and the '72 Iron Horse, which was very light, almost pink wine, still had the characteristics that you would find in Burgundy. It was made very well. It was a very nice wine. And every once in a while something would show up, but it'd be like one year, and then I guess Carneros Creek, Mahoney. Yeah, I think his '76 and '77 were both kind of well-made wines. I don't know what happened in '78 and beyond that, but.
How about, were you aware of Chalon at all? Did you get a chance to taste
Oh,
those
yeah.
wines? Or,
Yeah.
Anything from the
Calera, Chalon, yeah, actually the '76 Sanford and Benedict, which was a very good wine. But it would be like, I always wondered, well, what happened the following year?
Right.
It was, gee, they made a good one this year.
What happened the next year?
What happened the next year?
Which is actually one of the things that John Hager tries to talk about in his book, is what is this mystery of people who were making something that went up and was a star, and then, so did you have any theories? Was that a head scratcher for you? Did you go see these people?
No, I didn't go see the people. I just surmised that whatever they were doing, they had done it right by accident one time.
Probably pretty accurate. Most of us don't feel that well. What about, so did those tasting experiences of California Pinot make you feel like, oh boy, there is a future
Oh
here?
yeah, and there was a '76 from the Roqueoli Vineyard. I forget the link. Fenton Acres was the label on it. And that, when I tasted that, I knew that there were vineyards in Russian River Valley that produced really good wine. So that was our first goal in getting Pinot Noir was to go to the Roquille vineyard and talk Joe into selling us grapes, which wasn't hard because he was just selling grapes to Corbel at that time, and a few grapes to Davis Bynum.
Yeah.
And so there was room for us to get grapes, and he was happy to be paid, which in some cases he wasn't being paid.
Yeah, yeah.
So
Did he,
we developed a very strong relationship with Joe Roquille, and lucky for us, because that's what put us on the map.
right, and was that, I mean, did you know Joe socially at all, having grown up here, or?
Not really, no.
No, so you had to go knock on the door.
Yes.
And what was the initial reception?
Very good. Joe's a very nice man. You know, and he's a great grower, and he's just a farmer. He's a really nice man, good man.
So it's interesting to me, what I hear in some of that is that it was clear to you that there was real potential, and that that was something you were dedicated to exploring. And you decided, I'm going for this.
Yeah, I was curious, and yes, I've read every book I could on winemaking. Tried to find the oldest texts I could so that I could understand how wine was made without all the modern equipment, which we wouldn't be able to afford at our winery.
Did that worry you? Were you
No,
worried
no,
about
no,
not being-
no.
you
I
felt
thought
like-
making it very traditionally would be the best way to make the wine. We were able to also buy tanks very cheap because the milk industry was kind of on the wane, and we were buying milk tanks and taking the tops off. And those were our fermenters, and they were all stainless steel, jacketed, and they worked very well.
Yeah. You
And
wanted to
very
be
easy to
famous for
clean.
them.
Yeah, very easy to clean, and you know, made the wine come out the way we wanted it to, and you know, we were very happy and very fortunate, and we didn't get involved with buying a whole lot of new things. Or we borrowed our first stemmer crusher from Lytton Springs. Walt Walters was a friend. And so for up until I think '84, we borrowed the destemmer from him and returned it each year. I think in '84 we were able to buy it
Yeah.
because they bought new equipment. And the press was from another friend that used to own Mount Jackson Resort. It was in 1905, I think. Pacific Press, Foundry Press. It was a 1 3/4 basket press. So all of our equipment was used. Nothing was real fancy. We were making wine in the garage.
Yeah.
So we were really garagistas.
You see, Bordeaux never originates anything. I mean, the Garagistes started here. Sorry, I had to get in that guy. So, any consciousness of Oregon? Did you taste anything from Oregon? You know, or certainly wine being made in Oregon.
Yeah, there was wine being made in Oregon. Yeah, I tasted it.
I didn't set this up. And I love Oregon Pinot Noir. Okay.
I like some of it.
What about, anybody else got a question on those early days for Burt about that period when he and Ed, before they really transitioned to the commercial thing? Yeah, go ahead.
I have a question. Hi, Burt.
Hi, Ross.
I have a question. When we were working together briefly in '98, I remember you were inspired by and had some relationships, friendships with some Burgundy winemakers that came to visit you.
Right.
You had a dialogue that probably really inspired you and kind of gave you ideas. Can you name maybe 1 or 2 people that were kind of an inspiration and a person you developed this dialogue with?
Oh, Dominique Lafon would have been one of them. Yeah, he was a very good winemaker, very right-on taster. I mean, he could taste the wines and tell exactly what I had been doing. He really knew what he was talking about. And, yeah, he was very impressive. And I think he's still making very good wines, the Lafon wines.
And Any other questions? There were a couple other hands up on that.
So, Bert, if you had to borrow a stemmer crusher, why not whole cluster?
Why not whole cluster? Well, with whole cluster, I mean, that would work on some vintages with some vineyards. You're talking about in some years, you know, like the 96s that I brought. In 96, we had a heat spell, very hot August. And the heat spell ripened the fruit, but not the stems. The stems were very green still. And I really wouldn't want a whole lot of green quality to my wine. So I wouldn't want a whole lot of green stems in my wine. Now when stems are ripe and they're brown, and then they can add certain complexities, that's fine. You could go whole cluster, although I never did. We went, the highest would have been 50% whole cluster. Most of the people that bought our wine, I think, wanted something that was more drinkable immediately, not something that was a tannic monster. And certain clones, in my way of thinking, don't lend themselves to whole cluster.
Does that include the Pomard that you love?
Pomard works pretty good on whole cluster if the stems have got color,
Yeah.
but not the Mount Eden.
Was there any other, not to get geeky, but any other clones that Mount Eden Pomard that you were particularly enamored of at that time? Or selections or whatever?
Yeah, there was, you know, there's many clones that work to make wine. I mean, they make good wine. But my favorite clone probably, during my time at Williams and Selyem, would have been the Pomard clone, which Roffioli had.
And other questions on that period of time, Carol?
Hi, Bert. At what point did you, Russian River Valley wines, discover your first Sonoma Coast vineyard and start looking?
In '88.
And was that Cosigns?
No, Suma.
Zuma.
Any other questions on, we'll get to that right now, Carol. Any other questions on that, John?
Yeah, Bert, I'm just curious, when you guys were sort of in the garage and then sort of finding a small bonded facility, working with milk tanks, just kind of trying to band-aid everything together to make the vintage, were you thinking about, you know, what I think at the time was more a traditional route, you know, we're going to find some land, we're going to buy a vineyard, we're going to put it all together, or was it just sort of, we want to make this wine and we'll make it wherever we can make it?
Did everybody hear the question?
Yeah. You got it right. We'll make the wine, we'll make it wherever we can make it. No, we weren't going to buy vineyards.
You want to elaborate on that?
I was going to make wine, and I was going to take my time up. My partner's job was mostly in selling the wine, and that was going to take his time up. For us to start a third project when we both had other jobs, okay?
Yeah.
Now, see, that's the other thing. We never took any money out of the winery until 1990. So until December of '89, we both worked other jobs. We both worked our day jobs and made wine on the weekends and when we had time. So, no, to try and do a third, fourth, too much work, too much. So we relied on good growers like Joe Roffioli, David Hirsch, and Cobb family, and I think we did okay doing that.
I think so too. Yep.
I'm just curious, Bert. I never asked this, but when you met Joe, was there a real consciousness or perception about clones, Pinot clones, in those days?
Well, I asked him about his
Oh, so you
clones.
were thinking about clones?
Yeah, I asked him what clones he had planted.
How'd you get inspired to, you know, think about clones as just opposed to the?
Oh, just from reading and, you know, like whenever you're reading material on wines and especially Burgundies or Pinot Noirs, you always get interested in what clones were involved in the wine.
So did this
yeah.
come from France or
You
Or
only
use your
in
American
France,
Uh-huh.
there's a lot of literature about the clones and what they use when they make wine.
Okay, thank you.
Can I ask what was your favorite wine book or wine making book? Something that you referred to again and again? Is there something you can
Yeah,
consider?
Payneau's book.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, Andy?
I'm interested in those early days, maybe through the 80s. Did the grapes just show up at the winery when you decided to harvest them, or was it more of a collaborative effort throughout the growing season between you and the grower?
No, it was collaborative, and no, we would check the vineyards multiple times during the growing season. And when it was getting close to harvest, we would take 5-gallon buckets of samples for 3 or 4 different times until we decided it was time to get the grapes off. And again, with Joe Rocchioli being the wonderful grower, vineyard manager, he would do it within 24-hour notice,
That's great.
which again was a blessing for us.
It is. Let's go over here.
I wondered what the first label looked like in 1979 and early 80s, and who designed it.
I did. 1980, yeah. Yeah, it was a picture from Pickwick Papers. It was one of the illustrations out of the book, and then I designed the type around it. Being a printer, that wasn't a problem. When I wanted to get a serious label, I had a friend of mine that's a book designer who had never designed labels. I went to him and I told him I wanted him to design a label, and he goes, "Well, I've never done that." I said, "Well, make it look like a title page." His name is Graham McIntosh. He's one of the, he's a well-known printer when people are book collectors. This is a guy that when he designs a book, it's usually a collector's book.
Is there another question in the back? Yes, sir.
Were there any financial surprises in the first years in making it go, and any lessons that you learned?
No, we primarily did what we were told by older Italian winemakers, was to use used equipment, don't borrow money, which we never did. We never borrowed any money. So we never really got into any problems.
Great. Let's. I'd like to step forward just a little bit in time and get a little closer to our home here, and have you talk to us about. Obviously, you were very interested in the Russian River Valley. Talk to us about how you began to discover vineyards out here. Obviously, Suma was the first, as you alluded to, and what your first impressions were of this territory. First of all, what were the how did you become aware of them? And just give us a little background.
Okay, well, we got a phone call from Scott Zeller, who was sort of handling or doing the work in the Suma Vineyard for the Young family who owned the vineyard, who were his in-laws. And he wanted to see if we were interested in fruit, and that would have been in '87. So we came out, we tasted wines that they had made at home from, I think, 84, 85, 86 vintages. And all of the wines were very nice. They were homemade wines, but very nice. I took, I think, an 84 back to my lab, checked it out, and the pH was, I think, 3.6. And the acid was 0.70, and it had never been touched. So this was, the alcohol was, I think, 13.3 or something. And so I looked at it and I thought, well, gee, if they can make wine like this and they've never done a thing to it, this must be a pretty decent vineyard.
Were you worried about getting the right question? I mean, obviously,
yeah,
you
no,
hadn't made one from the neighborhood.
Especially with that vineyard, yeah. We were worried about the ripeness, but we were willing to take the fruit at 21.5 if necessary. So we wrote up a contract stating that, just to protect ourselves, you know. We didn't want an under 21.5, but we would take it at 21.5.
And did you, was there a vineyard character clear to you right away, or
Yeah.
did it,
Oh, sure.
you know, was the viticulture so different from the vine husbandry, so different from one year to another that it wasn't?
No, there was definitely, there was definitely a site and an area difference that you could tell.
And you want to put that in words for us? You want to give it a...
Well, I think there was sort of like, you could say a citrus or, a rind, maybe not a lemon peel, but an orange rind kind of character that was like a little different from anything in the Russian River Valley. Russian River Valley seemed to have more spicy qualities, dark spices. And the coast vineyards that we dealt with seemed to have more of this citrusy and Asian spice quality.
And so Suma was number one. What was the second one from the coastal?
Let's see, 88. I guess Coastlands in 92 or 93. What was 92, wasn't it? Yeah, 92.
So that's one ridge north. Both one is southwest from us, and one is almost due west. Right?
Yeah, very close. And let's see, in 94 was our first Hirsch.
So yeah, let's just to. I did ask Regina Martinelli when we were standing around at the beginning to help me out, but just to cite a few of those vineyards from planted in the early 80s, so people know. Hirsch out in Bohan Dillon Road. The Bohans was 76.
I think he might have started actually in the late '60s.
Yeah,
but it was a couple of vines at a
David's right.
time.
Okay.
Yeah.
But he was a logger and a rancher, so he'd come home and after loading up 5 or 6 logging trucks, and then he'd go out in the back 40 and plant a couple of vines, shoot a few deer.
And so you had David Hirsch, the Bohans, the Martinellis, sort of certainly by the early 80s. Suma, which we just referred to, was planted in 75, if I remember right? 75, 76, I believe it was planted.
Suma?
Yeah, wasn't it?
No. Well, maybe, yeah, probably then.
I think it was. And to our just east of us, the oldest Chardonnay planting that I'm aware of out here was Hillcrest, which is up by Harrison Grade Road. Any other vineyards that you were aware of out here? Was there anything else?
I think there were some vineyards in Morelli Lane, and I think there was a vineyard out by the Occidental Dumps. There's one up in there to the left.
Yeah. There was a bunch of stuff.
I think maybe Smith's owned that or something like that. I can't really remember. We checked out a few, tried to see what we could get, and because for us, as we were growing, to be able to use the coastal fruit meant we could use all of our equipment twice.
Yeah, Precious Mountain, I think, started late '70s. Didn't Donnie start in the
he
'70s?
started.
And once again, kind of like the Bohans, a few vines at a
And Wild
time.
Hog, anybody remember what?
I don't know if he planted before '80, but around that time, yeah.
And you just mentioned taste, flavor, components. Can you speak at all to your experience with the flavor components at Hirsch versus what the sort of that, if we can generalize, I know it's tough, but the Bohan Dillon area versus down here in Occidental? We talked about Asian spices here and some citrus wine. Were the Hirsch wines different?
Yeah, I would say the northern part of the Sonoma Coast, the grapes are, they come in different, and they come in at a different time, and the wines are different.
Darker fruits?
Darker fruits.
Mm-hmm. More tannin, less tannin than down here?
Maybe a little more tannin. I think, because of the exposure.
Yeah.
I think David's got really great exposure at where he is. I think it thickens the skin a little bit more.
So the memory I have of this period of time is having a phone conversation with Burt in probably early February of 1994, and talking to you on the phone about David's Place, and talking to Steve Kistler about David's Place. And everything at the time, David was going to Kendall Jackson, is that right? Or
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think Searidge got some.
We all wandered up there, and people come and talk to David and chose their parcels and whatnot. But I remember that feeling of, oh man, I'm so lucky to be part of this operation.
Little did you know.
But it was really it was an amazing moment, because all of a sudden, I mean, Littorai was nobody, but certainly Burt's reputation was by then full on, and Steve Kistler was, had really started to focus in on Pinot. I don't want to say instead of Chardonnay, that wouldn't be fair, but really focusing on Pinot quality. And so it was an amazing thing. I mean, almost instantly, David, it went from being sold to somebody who had a different business model to some really great producers. Any questions that you want to throw?
Yeah, just in terms of harvest dates, you were talking about being able to use all your equipment twice.
Mm-hmm.
What was the difference in time, or in lag time, between picking in Russian River and on the Sonoma coast, and in ripeness levels?
Well, it would depend on the year. It really depended on
Would
the
it
year.
be like a year, a week, 2 weeks?
Yeah,
difference?
with some vineyards it was 2 weeks. Now the wines that I brought, the 296s, the reason
Let's
I
go
brought
ahead and
those-
taste those if we can.
The reason I brought those wines is both the Sonoma, the coastlands and the river block were both planted in almost the same time. Okay, so the age of the fruit is very similar. And in '96, everything came in almost at once, not quite, but say.
It wasn't a lot of fun.
No, but the fruit came in very clean, ripe, with stems a little bit green. The pHs were a bit higher than normal due to the long hot spell. The Russian River harvest dates started on August 26th at Allen, ending on September 7th at the Olivet Lane Vineyard. Sonoma Coast harvest began on August 25th at Hirsch, ending September 15th at Coastlands, except for a small mother block that came in on October 2nd. So at Coastlands, yeah. So you can see that some years there isn't a lot of difference, but in most years there was usually 2 to 3 weeks in between the first coastal grapes coming after the first Russian River Valley grapes.
The thing that I find amazing in both of these wines, having lived through the vintage, is something I alluded to yesterday. We spend too much time, I think, as American winemakers trying to out-cool each other and say my region is cooler and less warm than your region. But here's a vintage that was a challenge because it was compressed and it was early.
Yeah.
And there's a wonderful sort of forest floor complexity to this wine in both of them that I don't get anything. There's no raisin quality to them. There's no stewy quality to them. They have that wonderful, pure expression that that Burt was so great at.
Yeah, also that year there was very little fog on the coast. That's why the coast came in almost at the same time. To give you the numbers here just so that you know what you've got, the 96 River Block was 20% whole cluster, spent 15 months in 2/3 new and 1/3 year-old barrels. The alcohol is 13.9, pH is 3.69. The tradable acidity of 0.608, free SO2 of 15 parts per million, total sulfur of 40 parts per million, and volatile acidity of 0.065. 591 cases of that wine were made. And of the coastlands, 96, was 17.5% whole cluster, 14 months and 2/3 new, 1/3 one-year-old barrels. 13.1 alcohol, pH 3.68, acid of 0.607, free SO2 16 parts per million, total SO2 39 parts per million, volatile acidity 0.060. So the wines are very similar.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? I mean, there's a world of difference between the two in elevation and topography and geology and all those things. Any comments, anybody want, or questions? Yes, sir.
Probably one question for Ross and Clifford. So, with coastlines, was this from the section where you have the mixture of the heritage clones? It's really quite a big blend. And then for the river block, what was the clone material there?
The river block would have been the Pomard clone that Rotilli has planted. Went from the west block to Tom's Little Hill and into the river block. The coastlands was both the hillside planting, that's Pine Hill or?
Old fir.
Yeah, Old Fir. And then from the mother block, which was only about 2 tons, I think.
Right.
Yeah, it was it was a small amount, but in the blended that you're drinking, it made up about 50%. We only made 393 cases of the coastlands.
Is that a Jackson clone?
Yeah, the expansion of the mother block, the nursery block, they came in quite a bit later, the 2 times you mentioned, it was
Yeah.
50%. That has 20 different clones on their own roots, planted as an experiment. So Jackson was, at that time, was one of those 20.
Okay.
And then later on, we expanded around the Jackson. That was actually Burt's idea.
Glad Ross is here to answer that question.
Yeah.
Because I would have just said, I don't know.
Other questions on the wines themselves? We threw in the Littorai that we wanted to just pick 2 other things. Hirsch, of course, we've just been talking about. Chariot's across the street from Suma. So you can throw a rock from one to the other. Suma being right at the crest of the hill and Chariot falling facing south. A little shallower soils probably than the Hirsch. I wanted to ask you also, we're going to try to wrap it up quickly, so if you have any other questions, think about them now. Talk to me just briefly about, I mean, you're very well known for making wines that age well. Here we have 2 different wines from 2 totally different places that have aged equally well. In your winemaking experience, did you end up feeling like there was an area or a site that made the most of your wines, or was it vintage, or?
Well, last week I just had an 85 Barocchioli that was drinking fantastically. And yeah, I had some wine once from Joe that he had made. I think it was 72. And it had just been stored in his barn. It's a single wall barn, not a double walled or insulated or any of those kind of things. It had just been stored near the floor, and probably had that wine in the late 90s, and it was still drinking fantastic. So, yeah, I think the Russian River Valley ages well, and I know the Sonoma Coast ages well too. So I think both areas can age. You know, if the wine is balanced, if you make the wine, if you pick the fruit before it's overripe, and you know, we always picked thinking not only of bricks but also of pHs and acidities. And in certain years, we threw the bricks out the window and we were just looking at pHs and acidities.
Meaning you didn't want them to get the pHs?
Well, that's right. We didn't want the pHs to go way up, and we didn't want the acid to fall out, because to me, then you really don't have a wine. It's a mess.
Yeah, David, question.
I'm just curious, Burt, you know, tasting these 2 96s, What was your, how did you approach the issue of, in terms of your winemaking, of the site specificity? Because I think what's beautiful, to me, what's beautiful about these wines, how pure they are, how they're clearly your wines, and yet they still show Joe and
Yeah, where they're,
coastal.
where they come
You know what I
from.
mean? They really have an identity of their own, and yet they're your wine. So how did you kind of address that in the winemaking?
Well, I tried to make all the wines the same. We use the same fermenters, and I wouldn't inoculate until the third or fourth day, and then I inoculated with a very, very small amount of our proprietary yeast, Williams and Selyem yeast. And it would be in the back corner, and the fermentations would start slow. And I did this with all the vineyards. We didn't rush a vineyard through, or we tried to get the vineyard to express itself in the fermentation process. And then all of the wood that I used was all Francois Frere Trancé oak. So I wasn't throwing a bunch of odd wood to mix up the flavors. In other words, I tried to keep it clean and pure so that you could taste the individual wines, and it all had the same kind of wood. So it wasn't a thing, well, we'll change the wood around on this one because it's from a different place. I thought doing that would be defeating the site specificity that I was seeking.
And we didn't get a chance to talk about Anderson Valley, but I'd like you just, if you would, just tell us about your ranch up there, what you've done, and what you're doing these days.
Yeah, I have a ranch in Anderson Valley. I planted it in 2000. It goes to Williams and Selyem, to my daughter Brogan. Went to Wooden Head for a while, and it goes to Jason Drew, Drew Family Wines, and a winery called Mira. And I made a little wine from it in 08 and 09. I labeled all the 08, so I'll probably release that in another couple of months. And the 09, we just got label approval, so I'll have to wait for the labels to come label that. All the other wineries that have been making wine from it have been since 2004. So any of those wines, the Brogan, the Wooden Head, they were all pretty good examples. And now Williams and Selyem is getting a lot of it. So, and they're making pretty nice wine from it. So it's a nice vineyard. It's got good exposure. We're at the deep end, what they call the deep end of the Anderson Valley. That was kind of a lucky thing that I ran into the vineyard when I did, or to the site. I was looking both in Freestone and in Anderson Valley. Because for years we also made, in 92 we started making an Anderson Valley wine, the Farrington. So I was familiar with Anderson Valley, knew it was a good spot. And it was cheaper land actually than buying in Russian River Valley. Although Sonoma Coast was still affordable. Freestone would have been affordable. I just couldn't reach a deal with the people that were the site I was looking at.
And you didn't mention 2010 or 2011, just the two vintages?
Yes. Yeah.
So you're going to officially retire?
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank everybody for listening in. It's been a treat for me up here, and Burt, we are so thrilled that you spent some time with us. So I think we're going to break briefly, Carol, is that right? 10 minutes or? It's a half an hour breakout. Coffee outside, half an hour. Enjoy.
That will give us time to put the glasses down and get set up.
You have to step up.